Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on buying in France. My name is Liz Rowlandson, editor of Place in the Sun magazine. I've been writing about property for 20 years. France was the last place I was visiting in February. It looks like France might be the place we're going to be able to get to most easily this summer. So we've got lots of questions about that and how to buy a property, everything you want to know about buying a property, going to live in France. So if you've got any more questions throughout the session, there's a question mark button on your panel. So press that and ping us a question and we'll try and get through as many as possible. We normally do these sessions at London's Olympia show. We can't do that this year, obviously. So this is your chance to ask all those questions that you might normally do at the show. So I'd like to introduce my panelists. Barbara.
Hello. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Hello, everybody. My name is Barbara Heslop. I am an English qualified solicitor working from the UK. The firm I'm a partner with Ashton's Legal. We have offices in East Anglia and we also have an office in Leeds. And from Leeds, where I'm based, we trade under the name of Heslop and Platt. I'm a fluent French speaker, an ardent Francophile. So like I'm sure many of our watchers and listeners, we help English-speaking clients with the buying process wherever they are, whether they're in the UK or in France or other parts of the world. So we can do all that remotely, and of course everybody's got used to remote working, and that's very much how we operate and can operate. So that's just a little introduction from me.
Brilliant. And Joanna Leggett? Great.
I couldn't hear Joanna. I don't know whether anyone else could.
Yeah, Joanna.
Can you hear me now?
No.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I'm Joanna Leggett. We're based in France. We've been running for just over 20 years. We've got numerous offices from the Côte d'Azur up to Brittany, Normandy, all around. We've got over 600 agents. And so we're here to help. All of our agents either have been born in France or have been, like British people, moved over and become agents. So we've all sort of been in the shoes of people that might be looking to buy a holiday home or moving over to France. So we can help with all sorts of situations and hopefully find the dream property.
Brilliant. I think last time we did a show, Joe, you were saying that many people are interested in moving to France full time rather than buying a holiday home. So we're going to run a poll first with our listeners. Why are you looking to buy a property in France? Is it A, so you can move full time, B, to buy a holiday home, or C, to buy an investment property? If you could let us know, that would be really great. Joe, just while we're waiting for the result, I mean, investment has become less popular, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, I would say with British clients, I mean, it really depends on the clients, you know, who we're talking to. But I've noticed that the last few Place in the Sun exhibitions that we've done, that usually, in the old days, it used to be a 50-50% split. 50% were looking for holiday homes, maybe 5% were looking for investment, and the rest were looking for, you know, a permanent home. But more recently, in the last year, and probably since Brexit, it seems to be a real massive swing. About 85% of the clients we've spoken to are actually looking to move to France permanently. So it has changed quite a bit from the holiday home or investment as such.
Brilliant. And yes, you're right. The result is 64 want to move full time, 34% want to have a holiday home, and only 3% want an investment property. So that's probably what you'd expect, would you know, in terms of your customers.
I think so. I mean, France is a lifestyle choice, generally speaking. You don't come here to make thousands of pounds on a property for investment unless you're buying in cities. It is much more the pace of life, the low crime rates. It is a lifestyle choice. And I think that's why people either move here or holiday home as opposed to investment.
Sure. And Joe, I think from Monday you were allowed to do property viewings since the lockdown is beginning to ease in France. Can you just give people an idea of what you can and you can't do at the moment?
Yeah, well, since yesterday, thankfully, we're back allowed out. Obviously, we're taking all the necessary measures with the masks and hand gel. We don't travel, or we recommend not to travel in the same car as clients, so we take separate cars. Our vendors are asked not to be in the properties when we're doing the visit, and usually with a 2-hour break before, the visit happens. All doors are left open, so nobody has to touch the actual doors as such, so that the environment is quite clean. We do have sprays, etc. So we're taking all the necessary precautions. But the thing is, people still want to move and people still want to sell. So everybody's been really, really helpful, and particularly with British buyers, because obviously they're not probably going to be able to come until maybe the end of June or July, and if they're trying to get in before Brexit, they're only going to have like a 3-month window. So we are asking our vendors that if they are going to be selling, or we do book in a visit with a British vendor, that they try to get their paperwork in order, that they have their diagnostic tests done, so that we know what the electricity is like. They get their FOSS septic reports in, their septic tank reports in, so that all the paperwork is ready for somebody like Barbara, for example, if somebody puts in an offer, so we can try and get the sale moving quicker, maybe within 5 or 6 weeks, which normally is, it's a 3 months to 4 months for a sale to go through. So we're doing everything we can to try to ensure that things run smoothly. At the moment, we're only allowed to travel 100 kilometres. So, that's fine for our agents because they all live and work in the area that they're showing properties. But for people that are coming from cities, and we are seeing a lot of the domestic market, the French market, trying to move out, it is quite difficult for them at the moment. So we may be waiting a few more weeks before we can travel further distances.
Yeah, I think maybe after June, there'll be another ease up, and there's a hope that lots of people might be able to drive down through the tunnel and get to France.
Exactly. I think driving will happen first. I mean, during lockdown, we've made a huge amount of virtual visits, and we've actually made sales with people not even seeing the property. Now we can do that in an even better way, because the agent can actually go to the property and do the virtual visit online with the client in the UK, so they can walk through, the client can ask questions and do live visits. And even if this means that they're not going to buy until they see it, at least they've shortlisted a certain number of properties that they might have wasted time on viewing when they do eventually get out. But yes, I think that driving will be the quickest way of getting here. The great thing about France as compared to Spain or Italy is you can be here in a day and you don't have to drive across France to get somewhere else. And I think that will open up first, because it's going to be the safest way of travelling. And then it's obviously just making sure that you have researched and done as much research as possible so that you can buy in the shortest time frame as well.
Brilliant. And Barbara, it could be argued that the COVID crisis has kind of bumped France into the 21st century with the notary system. And can you explain to people how, what changes have happened in the process that have been facilitated by the difficult conditions?
Sure, yes. And I mean, it has been a difficult few weeks, there's no question. And towards the end of March, when the notaries' offices were forced to close to the public, the French government did push through remarkably quickly a series of measures to relax, the normally very strict rules in terms of face-to-face signature meetings. And so certainly there was suddenly an ability for notaires to receive the signatures electronically in certain cases. The reality is that it's been a little bit patchy. Not all of the notaires have had the technology in place because the electronic signature was supposed to be matched with a video conferencing facility. And the simple fact is not all the notaires' offices have that video conference facility. So as I say, it has been pretty patchy. But the good news is that as from yesterday, the 11th of May, the notaires' offices are now opening again with very strict precautions pre-arranged meetings, and then obviously face masks have to be worn, and only very limited number of people in the office at the same time. So we're hoping that we're going to see a gradual return to some sort of normality, the new normal, or whatever that's going to be. And but things have still been progressing, but various of the formalities that the notaire has to deal with have been stalled, and again they're just starting to sort of be allowed to continue. So
brilliant. And Joanna, how has in the UK we're seeing a lot of interest in rural properties, a move away from the cities. Are you seeing that in the different appetites for properties for new searches?
Yeah, I definitely think that since this crisis, things have changed massively. Firstly, we've had huge amount of increases to our website viewings and inquiries, basically because people are at home and not working, so they've got more time to look online, I expect. What we have seen an increase for our French website from our French clients is a 57% increase from Parisians looking at countryside properties. So I can see that this crisis has affected people, and some people are going to be thinking, well, life's more important and I can work from outside of a city, etc., etc., or families are more important than being locked up in a flat. And we have seen massive increases in the inquiries to countryside properties. So where they've always been secondary, you know, to cities because of work, generally speaking, I think that will change, and I think there will be a much higher demand for rural locations where people have more space. We've also seen an increase in, not just from the general public, from journalists across the world looking for properties that have offices in the garden, you know, garden rooms or outbuildings that could be converted into a garage. And we've seen an increase in inquiries for this as well, you know, where people have actually specified we need an outside building that could be transformed into a working environment as such. So I think it is changing. I think, you know, people are going to tend to, after what has happened here, in case it ever happens again, look at buying slightly outside of the city in a countryside location.
Sure, and as far as there's going to be massive changes to air travel as well, certainly for the next couple of years, being able to drive to France is a wonderful advantage, isn't it? I mean, yeah. Your area is very drivable, but you can drive. I mean, you can drive the whole way, obviously, but it's that sort of down to the Dordogne is particularly accessible, isn't it?
Yeah, of course, and it depends which way you travel. I mean, if you come into Calais, if you went from Calais to the Côte d'Azur, you're looking at 1,200 kilometres. That's a long drive to try and do in one day, and you're still staying in France. There are lots of different ports that come in at different areas. So, for example, I would do Newhaven to Dieppe, which is a 4-hour crossing. It gets me into Dieppe, and then it's just under 6 hours to get to where I live in the Dordogne. So it's easily drivable in a day and further. And I think that's the benefit of France. And I think this year, or next year in particular, France will become probably, you know, it might overtake Spain again, because you can get there in a day. If you're driving with pets or animals, you know, you need to be in a car anyway. And you know, if you are driving to Spain or Italy, you're probably going to have to stop off in France because it's too far to drive in one day to go anywhere else. And that is the benefit. And also trains. The trains are still running. Eurostar's still running, and obviously that's stopping off in Paris, and it's stopping off in the countryside near me. It stops off in Angoulême, which is 25 minutes from my house. So the trains are another way of travelling, which can be quite safe as opposed to the airports. I think it's the airports, not the flights themselves. I think it's the airports where they've actually had the problems. And that people's safety, they might be more worried about flying other than it actually is safe and may take to the roads. So we may see more ferry crossings as such, and then people driving as far as they can drive.
I'm sure we will. Barbara, we're having a lot of questions about mortgages. I mean, is it possible to get a mortgage at the moment? Has the crisis affected the record low mortgage rates that we've been seeing in France the last couple of years? And what's the typical criteria for English buyers?
Yeah, I mean, certainly over the last few years, there have been some very attractive low interest rates available to UK buyers looking for a French mortgage. The French banks have a very strict lending criteria, however, and I think, you know, in terms of UK buyers looking to buy a second home and wanting to take out a French mortgage, you know, the whole COVID situation if their job security has lessened, or if there has been a real impact on their income, and obviously that's going to potentially impact on how much they could borrow and how attractive they're going to be as future borrowers to the French banks. So, but I don't see that there's going to be any drastic change in how the French banks approach, lending to UK buyers. There's a strong market there. We generally recommend to our clients that they use a good experienced French mortgage broker, either an English one in the UK or an English-speaking French mortgage broker in France, because they will smoothen the process. It's a very bureaucratic process, and you need to provide an awful lot of information. But a good broker will talk to you at the outset and give you an idea of your potential borrowing capacity, and also talk to you about the various mortgage products that are available. So that's the top tip, really, in terms of looking for a French mortgage. Find a really good broker.
Just to jump in there, Liz. Yesterday we had like some talks with BNP Paribas, which is one of the biggest banks in France, and they've just said that they are now not going to lend to airline staff, restaurant staff, etc. So that's quite a big change. It's not meaning that all banks are going to be the same, but BNP, who does generally tend to Brits, has changed their criteria on who they will now lend to since the crisis. Hopefully by next year that might change, but at the moment airline staff used to be big buyers of properties in France because they travelled so much. But because of the crisis, they have now said that they will not lend to airlines, which is very sad.
Yeah, well, that's a classic change in their financial circumstances, exactly. Which is a no-no. Yeah.
I don't know whether he works in a restaurant or the air industry, but we had a question, Barbara, from someone who's 58. Would he be able to get a mortgage? What sort of term is typical? Could he get a mortgage for 15 years?
Yeah, I think 15 years would be the absolute max, but yes, that shouldn't be a problem, to be honest.
Okay.
As long as the financial stack up, yeah.
And they have fixed rates and flexible. Are they the same types of mortgages as we're used to in the UK?
Yeah, absolutely. They're not quite as varied, perhaps, as you could get in the UK, but certainly there's an option of a fixed rate or a variable rate, or even a combination of the two I've seen. So part repayment and part, so we're saying fixed rate or variable rate, or a mixture of both. Yeah.
Brilliant. We're going to actually have another poll now. We've touched on certain areas of France, but what is your chosen area of France? Is it the north, Brittany and Normandy, the west, the Dordogne, Charente, Bordeaux, the central area, the Loire, Limousin, Auvergne, or the south, including the Alps and the Côte d'Azur and the lovely Languedoc? So if you can let us know, and we'll see if the air issue might be playing into people's choices, or whether the southwest is as popular as ever. Joe, what do you reckon?
I would say the southwest, generally speaking, is always the most popular. In fact, the poll results are coming through, as I can see. But I would generally say it's always been a favourite with the Brits because of the prices, the weather, and it's easy to get to. That has always been, one of the most popular areas. The other area I think we sometimes forget is the Alps. The Alps is massively popular as well. Probably the southwest, because of the pricing, is generally the best for Brits. But it'd be interesting to see. Is that the results of the poll coming through now?
Sure. So we've got 45% for the west, as we might expect. We've got 34% for the sunny south, 10% for the north, and 11% for the central area. So that's kind of quite a good spread, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the central regions are the cheapest in France. So if you've got a really small budget, but you want a really large property, then the Limousin and the Cruz, for example, is the best areas to buy in. But the old favourites have always been the Dordogne. You know, you'll see so many television programmes on the Dordogne on British television. So it has been an old favourite. But southern Brittany as well, and, you know, Brittany and Normandy are also big popular favourites with the Brits, which is where we see most of our clients coming from, or going to, should I say.
Sure, we've touched on access and drivability, but what other factors should, if people are coming to France on a property viewing trip, what other factors do they need to consider, Jo?
Well, first of all, do as much research, particularly now since we've had this sort of crisis. You know, you don't want to be spending weeks and weeks trying to find the right area. I would definitely do as much research as you can online beforehand. You know, actually speak to the agents that live and work here. Ask them as many questions. You know, put together a big question sheet. Ask them what the social life's like. Is the village open in the winter? Because a lot of towns close down in the winter and are open between April and September, and then the tourists all go and there's nobody there. So for permanent moves, it's really important to make sure that you're at least near a working town or village where people live there all year round. Also, don't try to fit too many properties in on one viewing trip, because France is huge. It's the biggest country in Western Europe. And some of the distances, you can be an hour between properties. It's not like, you know, in London where you might be 3 streets apart. Mind you, it might take you an hour to get between 3 streets apart in the traffic, but it is quite big. And so, you know, really plan your trip well. For us as an agency, we have an in-house call centre who actually plan the itinerary for you, so you can pick your selection of properties. They'll know the distances in between and they'll do that for you. But the most important thing is research, and also budget. You know, research what the area prices are, because, you know, sometimes you could turn up in the Côte d'Azur with 150,000 and be really disappointed that you just can't find anything that's suitable because you've just budgeted for the wrong area. So that's quite important as well. Do as much as you can online before coming over to France and actually making those visits.
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity for people to do lots of research while they're locked down. Barbara, we've had a few questions about, we've touched on how long it takes to buy a property. Linda Miller says, how long does it take to purchase a property? And are there any loopholes to be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, the usual timescale for completing a purchase is 3 to 4 months from when you make your offer. And it is difficult to shorten that timescale because of the various formalities that have to be carried out in France. And I mean, in terms of, you know, starting to look at property and then finding a property that you perhaps want to buy, you know, there are various things that you need to be aware of and be ready to know what questions to ask. One of the things that people don't realise, when you buy through an estate agent, often it's the agency that will draw up the first contract. So the notaire isn't involved, okay? And the notaire will only become involved further down the line once there is a binding contract in place. And people sometimes don't appreciate that at the early stage. I mean, obviously we work with Joanna's company, Leggett, you know, a lot, and they'll look after you and they have their own contracts and so on that we're familiar with. But some other small agencies, you know, will just print off the contract as soon as the client makes their offer and say, there you go, sign it, you know. So these are the sort of things that you need to be prepared for, because you shouldn't be signing anything that you don't fully understand. So, you know, I know Joanna's company, you know, provide a translation, an English translation, and will be very helpful in guiding their clients through the process. But not all the agencies, you know, offer the same sort of level of support. So it's really being aware of, you know, and the language is a huge obstacle for the vast majority of our clients. And then, you know, when you're looking at properties, you've got to sort of have your eyes wide open. We spend a lot of time looking at planning issues. So, for example, if a property has already been extended, you know, making sure that the owners or previous owners who extended it or put in the pool got the right planning authorization and had it signed off, because we don't want our clients to buy a property and then find out that you know, the extension was done in breach of planning rules or whatever. And it's the same if clients know they want to buy this property, but they know they will want to extend it or put a pool in, then we talk to them about, you know, making the contract, the purchase contract, conditional on getting that authorization as part of the process. So these are the sort of things that you need to be aware of and alive to, and know what sort of questions you should be asking.
Brilliant. And Joe, we had a question about should I use more than one agent to look at properties? Now, obviously you're going to say no, use Leggett, but I mean some areas.
No, I'd say use many Leggett agents.
In some areas, it's not really, there aren't that many agents, and also there's a key difference between agents that deal with French buyers and overseas buyers, isn't there?
Well, I would say, I mean, in France it's quite different to the UK. They don't go for the exclusive mandate as much as they do, the listing as much as they do in the UK. So one property could have 6 agencies all looking after it, you know, not just us. I mean, we deal with international and French. Half of our agents are French. We've also got Dutch, German, Spanish, English, you know, Scottish, whatever. So we do deal with international. The local people tend not to use an agency at all, because if they live in the village or the town, they tend to find the property on one of the, you know, the French portals. They can negotiate themselves because they're French, and they go direct to the notaire. So in the old days, it used to be about 45 to 50% of sales didn't actually use an agent. They would just go direct to the notaires, and that tends to happen, for example, in this small village where I live. If a French just wanted to buy another house for another French person, they would just do it directly together. However, if you are buying privately and you're not going through an agency, then I would definitely recommend using, for example, Barbara, because you don't know whether the price is correct. You haven't got an agent looking after you, and then you do need somebody who speaks the language, who can look through the contracts and, you know, deal with the sale for you. Not saying that the notaires aren't great, but obviously not all of them speak English, although most of them do these days. A lot of them don't. So if you're buying privately, without doubt, I would involve a UK solicitor to help you through that process. With regards to agencies and who to use, you know, if it's an exclusive mandate, you have no choice but the agency who has the exclusive mandate. However, other than that, I would really base it on the service and the trust. You know, how long has the agency been going? Is there good reports? Do they have a lot of properties for sale? And base it on, you know, did you get a good rapport from them? Have you met them? Have you spoken to them on the phone? And then choose it that way. But, you know, there is a choice. There's a lot of agencies out there. And some of the French, unfortunately, don't speak any English at all. And in those circumstances, and also, you know, when I first came to France to buy a house, you know, I arrived at 5 to 12, and it's like, sorry, you know, we're going for lunch, come back at 2. You know, and I'm only here for the weekend, you know, I've only got this sort of weekend gap, but they don't care. Life is more important for them, and the lunch is extremely important. So, you know, it really depends on, you know, if you find you will find the right property with any agency. The good thing about international agencies like ourselves is that we do tend to have more properties than, say, the local French agency, because English vendors or American vendors or South African vendors that might be selling don't speak brilliant French, particularly if they're a holiday home. So they will give it to an agency that will speak their language as well. So there might be properties on the books that you wouldn't see on a normal French website because they haven't given it to the local French agent. So there's sort of swings and roundabouts with both, really.
Can I just mention one other point on that, which is at the outset, you know, if you're saying that you're a cash buyer, that means you've got the money ready. You know, we often see situations where people have arranged viewing trips and they haven't actually sold their UK property yet. And so then they find this property they want to buy. And then you're in a situation of having to get the sellers and the notaire to agree to the contract being conditional on the UK sale. And as Joanna will confirm, you know, yes, you can do it, but it gets very stressful. So we always try to encourage clients to, you know, to sell first in the UK, get your money in the bank, and then you're in a much stronger position as a real cash buyer to negotiate a good purchase. Sure. Similarly, you know, if you've had an inheritance and you're waiting for it to go through, you know, just hold your horses and try and resist the temptation, because far better if you know, you've got the cash in the bank before you start looking.
Brilliant. And
Yes.
Barbara, if we could stick with you for a second, we've had quite a few questions about property taxes. Mario Constantinou asks, apart from property price and estate agent fees, how much funds do I add on top of that? You know, sort of closing costs.
So for the what's called the notaire fees, the frais de notaire, you need to be budgeting for between 7 and 8% on top of your purchase price. Okay, and so just under 6% is actually the stamp duty, the purchase tax, and the rest is the notaire's fee. So 7 to 8% on top of your purchase price, payable in France to the notaire on completion.
Okay, that's great. So you've touched on it already, Barbara, but I mean, are there any other aspects of the French purchase process that are a little strange for buyers to get their head around?
Yeah, certainly. When you buy and sell in the UK, all the search and inquiries are done first, and then you exchange contracts and you complete quite quickly. That's how it works in the UK, whereas in France, you actually sign the contract at a much earlier stage, and that contract is conditional on the search results and the various formalities all coming through okay. And then you'll have a period of time before completion. So, you know, for example, you make your offer, the contract will be signed usually within a month of the offer being signed, and then the contract will indicate a target date for completion of the purchase, and that target date is likely to be, you know, 2 months or so down the line. So that's quite a big difference, that you sign the contract early and then have to wait 2 months to complete. And importantly, that completion date, it is just a target. It's not a fixed date. And so, you know, you won't know until possibly 2 weeks before the actual date that the notaire is fixing for completion, which obviously can be a little bit tricky if people are trying to arrange removals or travel, you know, travel arrangements. But that's one of the things. What else in terms of the differences? Don't forget about the importance of a survey. You know, there's a bit of a myth that the French don't do surveys, but again, we always say to clients, well, if you wouldn't buy a property in the UK without having your own survey, then, you know, why would you buy in France? So don't discount it. It's perfectly possible to have your own independent survey, and a lot of our clients do. And that's not the same as the diagnostic reports, which the seller has to provide. They're only telling you about certain parts, certain elements of the property. So we're talking about thinking about having your own independent structural survey.
That's some great advice. Joe,
there was one just other thing, which just picking up on Barbara, is the other thing that we forget when we sign the compagnie de vente as a buyer. Once the vendor signed, he can't actually pull out. So you can't get gazumped like you can in the UK as much, because as soon as he signed the compagnie de vente, there are no suspensive clauses for the vendor, only for the buyer. So if the buyer doesn't get the permissions met, or the permission to build, you know, to change the barn use or to get a mortgage, etc., they can still withdraw from the sale and have their 10% deposit back, whereas the vendor can't. So as in the UK, for example, you could, you know, go to completion and then the vendor pulls out. That doesn't actually happen in France. So from a buyer's point of view, it is quite safe. Well, not so much for the vendor, unfortunately.
Okay, and just on timing, Joe, normally in August on the continent is holiday time. People go away, including estate agents. Karen Ellis is hoping to travel to France for 2 weeks in August to set up some viewings for properties. Is that going to be a good time, assuming she can get to France?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole world has changed, and I think whatever happened in August last year, you know, people want to run their businesses. They want to have, you know, the worst in France used to be the restaurants used to close for 2 weeks because all the restaurateurs went on holiday in August. But as soon as they've been closed for months, I think that'll be the last thing they'll be doing. So I think that this August in particular, everybody's going to be open. I know with international estate agents and particularly British estate agents, we're open every day of the year. You know, we've even done viewings on Christmas Eve. I've even done a viewing myself on Christmas Eve. So, and I think this August there won't be, as long as everybody can travel and everybody can get here, there won't be any problems with anybody being open. Even the notaires who, you know, notoriously are closed during August, I think this year will be an exception because people need to move and we don't want the backlog of it, you know, it's stacking up during the August months.
Brilliant. Okay. We're going to quickly run another poll because we've got lots to get through. What sort of location are people looking for? A, a town, B, the outskirts of a village, C, by the beach, or D, in the middle of nowhere? We've already touched on the trend to move to rural locations away from the cities with the high rates of COVID-19. So maybe we've got the results. 67% on the outskirts of a village, much more than anywhere else. 13% in a town, 9% by the beach, and 10% in the middle of nowhere. So that's really interesting, Joe, isn't it? It's that sort of dream property of being on the edge of a village. You can walk to get your baguette in the morning. You can walk to the bar and back again. Is that really what most people want?
It's absolutely typical of the clients that we see coming to France at all the exhibitions that we do. Everybody wants to be able to walk to the boulangerie. They don't want to have to drive. They want the lifestyle, which is the wine and cheese and the baguettes and, you know, meeting the locals and chatting with them over a Ricard or a Pinot in the morning. And that is quite true as well, I think, of the beach. I saw that the beach was quite low there. And that does tend to be the case, bearing in mind that most people are looking for a permanent home, because the beach is much more for holiday homes and rental opportunities to rent them out. If people are looking for permanent homes, they don't want to be in a location that, you know, is full of tourism and no locals actually live there. So the edge of the village is probably one of the most popular things we get asked on the inquiry searches, that they, you know, unless they're looking for work or they, you know, they want to work in a town, then the edge of the village, they don't want to be in the middle of the village surrounded by loads of people, but they want to be able to walk in. And I would say that the poll is very, very typical of the inquiries that we do get on, you know, through the websites.
Yeah, on the subject of work, Joe, we've had a few questions about, you know, can I work in France? I mean, many people choose to set up a business, don't they, as a way to fund their lifestyle.
Well, France's biggest asset was its tourism. You know, see what's happened, you know, maybe not so much this year, but there are 82 million tourists that visit France every year. So if you're looking at setting up a business in anything to do with the tourist industry, whether that's a cafe, a chambre d'hôte, a gîte business, etc., you're guaranteed that there are going to be enough people coming through. Even if they're the one-night stays because they're traveling to somewhere else in Europe, a lot of transient clients will come through France as well. So yeah, from the tourist industry, it's generally a great place. For any other type of industry, if you want to actually have a career or work for a company, you are going to have to speak the language, because there's just no way that you're going to be able to go and work in a company if you don't speak French. So that sort of narrows down the type of work that you can actually do. People do set up, I mean, you know, in the construction industry, if you're teaching industry, if you can teach English, that's the possibility. If your French isn't great, you might be able to teach English, particularly in primary schools with your qualifications that you might have from the UK. But generally speaking, most of the clients that come to France are either semi-retired, they're not generally retirees. We're seeing much more young families coming that can either commute from the UK, or one of the partners commutes from the UK, or you can work online. I mean, with the internet these days, you can work anywhere in the world, you know, because if the business is run online, it doesn't matter where you live. And I think that's why we see a swing for the lovely lifestyle and the low crime rates. You know, very little crime. I don't lock my front door. You know, you can go out and forget and it doesn't matter because there's nobody there. Insurance is really low because there is little crime. Car insurance is very low, things like that. So it's generally a really, really lovely way of life. And I think that's why people do come and people do want to be in the countryside.
Sure. And is it easy to get children into the local school, for instance, if you move across with young children?
Yeah, I mean, that's the difference between estate agencies in France to the UK, I think, because we do a proper hand-holding service. You know, I've been with young families and I've made appointments to the local mairie. I've taken the families, we've gone to look around the school, you know, we've had a look round, we've met the locals, we've met for other parents and things like that. So whichever agent or whichever area you're looking at, the agent may have children themselves and will be able to help you. One of the things I would definitely recommend is that you put them into the local school, not into the international schools, because they need, particularly if you're a village life, they need to have local friends, and they need to be part of the community and be able to go to local children's houses. A lot of people do make the mistake by thinking, oh, I'll send them to Bordeaux and, you know, put them in the international school because they speak English, but that's not always the best solution. Children are like sponges and they'll pick up the language within a few months, particularly if they're sort of under 6 or around that sort of age. Much more difficult for teenagers. You know, they will struggle if they're brought over at a teenage age because, you know, they are going to be thrown into a school. So if they haven't got any French, that will be quite tough. But for young children, and getting them into the schools is great. And the local communities welcome the children, because you can imagine that a lot of young families in the past will have moved to city centres because there's more work. So having younger children come into the community is great for the village and it's great for the community. So they are very, very welcoming.
Brilliant. And on the subject of sort of foreign buyers, we've had a question, Barbara, from an American called Laurie Cronwell. As an American buying property in France, are there any advantages to buying as a full-time French resident over being a non-French, non-EU resident as far as taxes and fees?
Do you think he's talking about moving permanently then?
Yes, a full-time resident, yeah.
Full-time resident. It won't affect, you know, I mean, for you at the, I don't know much about the US tax system, but I believe it's quite sort of punitive in terms of taxing the worldwide assets.
Yeah.
But it's not going to change, you know, how French inheritance tax, for example, would apply to a French property that he leaves to his beneficiaries. So the residency aspect, I mean, if he's resident in France on death, then the French tax authority would tax him as a French tax resident. You know, you
Sure.
can't choose if he's resident in France on death. Then France would look to tax his worldwide assets. So I think that's the best answer I can give at the moment.
I guess once we're going to be out of the EU next year, so Joe, we're going to be in a similar situation. We're going to be in the same situation as Americans potentially, as far as what we're going to be taxed, depending on if we're buying a holiday home or a full-time home.
Yeah, that is quite unfortunate that we did come out of Europe. But what I will say, it will affect particularly holiday homes, where at the moment you can come and stay in your holiday home for 6 months if you want to, or for 8 months and then go back. What will happen is not becoming a part of the EU, unless they form some sort of treaty between English and France, which they could do because we had a lot of treaties that were outside of Europe anyway. You will only be able to stay in your French holiday home for 3 months. Then you'll have to leave for 90 days before you can come back again, because that's how other, you know, out of Europe, like Americans or whatever, can stay in a holiday home. So for those, and it affects South Africans as well. For they like, you know, would spend 6 months and then 6 months, but obviously you can't do that anymore. And that will be the same for the Brits. You won't be able to stay for long periods of time in your holiday home unless, you know, they form some other treaty. The capital gains tax will be higher. If you sell your holiday home, obviously you won't be a European citizen. So when you go to sell, I don't know the exact amount because I'm not an accountant, but we can obviously recommend accountants as such. But the capital gains tax will be higher than it would have been had we been in the EU on selling a property.
Sure. And Joe, without going into too much detail, because I know it's a very complex issue, healthcare, what are the options for people maybe just pre-retirement?
Well, that's always been a bit of a tricky issue, and you know, as we say, we don't actually know yet. I mean, if you're working and living in France, like someone like myself, you're in the French tax-paying system. If you're in the French tax-paying system, you're entitled to the same healthcare as the French, whatever nationality you are, whether you're American, British, or whoever. You would, you know, you're paying tax. You're a French resident, so you're entitled to the 70% healthcare, and you buy 30% top up. There was always a little bit of a gap between the pre-retirement retirees and the retirement age, where that was always a little bit uncertain, and you would need to speak to an expert about that. When you actually had retired as an EU citizen, the British government would pay for any healthcare that you had. It was reciprocal, the same with the French in the UK. At this stage, we still don't know whether that's still going to be reciprocal or what will happen with that healthcare. And I'm not a healthcare expert, but I'm sure, as I said before, with us being such close neighbours, that there will be something sorted out between Britain and France. And you've got to remember that I'm talking about Britain, not, you know, America or anywhere else, but there are actually more French people in the UK than there are Brits in France. So whatever happens, it's got to be reciprocal between the two countries.
Sure. A bit of a lighter niche question. Darren Buck is looking to purchase a property in the Dordogne with a glamping business. Do you know anything about permissions to do that? Is that quite a tricky venture?
No, I would say that there's a lot of campsites that do come up for sale, and to change that to glamping obviously would be, you know, it's just in the style, which would be great, and we would welcome those. I have a lot of family that come over would really like that, so do come and set one up. Yeah, the only difficulty will be in greenbelt areas or areas where there isn't camping already, because they don't give out that many licenses anymore. So you may have to buy something that is already established, or you know, you can turn it from something that maybe just tents or caravans or however many lots. But it would certainly be something you'd need to look into. Don't just go ahead and think you can set one up, because you definitely can't. So you'd need to look into the legalities of that. You can do something that's called camping à la ferme, which means that you have to have less than 5. But if you want to do glamping on a bigger scale or a campsite, then you would need to look into whether you can legally have one there or take over somebody else's and change it.
Sure, that's great.
Sorry, I was just going to say, in most communes, the starting point for that is to look at what's called the PLU, which is the local structure plan, the Plan Local d'Urbanisme, which, you know, will give an indication as to what is permitted in what areas. So, you know, that's the starting point. But as Joanna said, definitely don't assume you can set up a glamping business if there isn't something there already. The rules can be quite strict, and they will vary from area to area as well.
Sure. I'm Barbara. Before we do a few final quick fire questions, because we've got so many more questions and we're running out of time, just can you touch very briefly on inheritance? It's a very different system in France. Can you just explain just very briefly why it's how it's different and why people might need to consider how they're buying or making a will?
Sure. So, I mean, as soon as you own a property in France, whether you're resident in France or non-resident, French inheritance rules and French inheritance tax will apply to that property. And one of the basic aspects of French inheritance law is that children, that's natural or adopted children, have what's called reserved heirship. So they have reserved rights to inherit from their parents, okay? But excluding stepchildren, stepchildren have no such reserved rights. And so if you don't take any special measures when you become resident in France or you buy a holiday home, on your death, children would be entitled to inherit a share of the property, you know, in preference to your wife or husband, you know. So and then there's something called Brussels 4, which is the EU succession regulation, which actually now does give British nationals the option to escape those French rules, so that they can say, well, we don't want those French rules to apply. We want to have freedom to choose who inherits from us, and to perhaps postpone the entitlement of the children until the death of the second spouse. And so you can make an election of the law of your nationality, okay? And that has to be done by a will. And so that's something that we look at regularly with our clients. But it doesn't change the tax position. So by choosing the law of your nationality, so that you've got freedom to leave everything to your husband or wife in the first instance, that doesn't change, you know, the tax position. Although there is no tax between married couples, but it's a complex area, and you know, it needs to be looked at carefully. And it's especially important to look at it at the time that you're buying, so you can structure the purchase in the right way, and then at the same time put in place will.
Okay, thanks. Right, we're going to whiz through a few quick fire questions. So if you can kind of try and keep it as short as possible so we can get through a few. Joe, someone was asking about the relevance of the July deadline you mentioned in terms of buying before Brexit.
Well, that was basically just that we don't think Brits are going to be able to come on free visiting trips until July. If to be able to complete by and be in their property by December, bearing in mind, as you know, both myself and Barbara said, it could take from up to 4 months to complete. They may need to make that offer between July and October so that, you know, the sale can complete before December. The only way around that is if you haven't completed by December and you're sort of in the process, is rent somewhere so that you're living in France and you've become a French resident before the 31st. That's the only other suggestion I could make. But that deadline is based on, that's your deadline if you want to be in your home before December the 31st.
Brilliant. Thanks, Barbara. What is the minimum amount that you can borrow for a mortgage?
I would say €80,000.
Brilliant. Okay. We've got questions about the easiest way to set up money in euros. Well, it's to use a currency broker. We have one at aplaceinthesun.com, so we can have information on our website. We've covered mortgages. An English person living in Ireland, any difference to the? Well, they're in the EU.
It depends on their passport. It depends whether they're European passport or if they're Irish British passport. It really depends on that.
Okay. I mean, do I take out a mortgage or pay cash? Well, it's a question of whether you want to.
It depends on the value of the property, because obviously France has wealth tax. So if you're going over the wealth tax amount, which I think, Barbara will correct me, I think is 1.2 million. If you're buying something that's over that amount, you might, is it 1.3? Might want to take a mortgage for, you know, so you're only borrowing 700, then you become under the wealth tax because the other money's borrowed. But generally speaking, I would just shop around. Is it better to borrow against your home in the UK or your home, or take out a mortgage in France? And what's available? You know, as we said before, some of the banks are going to be limiting who they lend money to these days.
Sure. Now here's a good one. Do you see the current crisis impacting the prices for French rural property, Joe?
Do we see? Oh no, that's the tricky question. I think I wasn't sure if I'd spoken about that before, but city prices were at the limit. They'd risen some areas 20%, so they're not going to go any higher, and they may come down a little bit. But country properties haven't really gone up since the crash in 2008 when they were at their peak. They may have raised to maybe 3% in some areas, but it's been very, very stable. And with the demand now for people wanting to be out in the countryside, I don't think we're going to see any drop at all in countryside properties. We may see a slight drop in town and cities, but I think the countryside will stay pretty much stable.
Okay, that's great. This is another interesting one. What are the panel's view on leaseback apartments in the Alps? Well, I could go on for about half an hour, but Joe, what's your? I mean, it's a bit of a can of worms, isn't it, legally?
Well, we don't tend to deal with leaseback, so I'll let you answer that one, Liz, because I know you've had great experience with that one.
Barbara might have something to say from a legal perspective.
Yeah, I have to admit, I've never been a big fan of leasebacks. and I've seen a lot of problems with them where basically buyers have bought into a leaseback scheme with a supposed guaranteed rental, which doesn't materialise, and it all goes pear-shaped. And the French courts are full of cases where people are alleging that they were missold these leaseback investments. So yeah, I try to steer clients away from them, but I have seen some which have operated successfully and clients are happy. So the best thing is to use one of the better known leaseback operators if you're going to do it.
Yes, it's all in the management, isn't it?
Yeah, in the Alps they are quite good at leaseback, so hence why you probably know, Liz, from your Alps experiences.
Okay, moving on to slightly less controversial ground. Jo, in your experience, what's the one thing that people are not taking into account when buying a property in Provence?
Well, I would say, I mean, the Provence has always been an absolutely really popular area. It's absolutely stunning. It's beautiful. I think the distances between the towns is quite big. And, you know, there is big gaps between, you know, you'll have one village and it may take you half an hour to 40 minutes to get to the next one. So I think perhaps the distances, but I mean, the Provence is absolutely stunning. It always holds its prices, you know, particularly with Brad Pitt and Angelina and people like that buying down there, you know, pushing them all up again. But no, I would just say that it's huge and there is a lot of distance. So just make sure that you are near, if you need to be near a city for hospitals and things like that, for example, you don't want to be too far out in the countryside where it's going to take you 45 minutes to an hour to get there.
Sure. It does get very hot in Provence. It does get very hot in Provence.
That's true, yeah.
And it's very touristy in parts, isn't it? So it depends what you want. Just another quick question. We've touched on this. If you're unable to buy before the end of this year, what additional restrictions are likely to apply in the new year? Barbara first.
So if you're going to, if you're planning to move permanently to France and you're a UK national, then you're going to be treated as what's called a third country national. And so there are going to be more restrictions and tighter restrictions on income levels and that sort of thing, possibly a language test, I believe. So there are going to be extra hurdles that you're going to have to jump over or through if you're not there until January next year.
Sure.
I think from our point of view, obviously Brits have been living in France before Europe. You are going to have to apply for carte séjour, and as Barbara said, you are going to have to prove that you've got enough money to live on. That used to be in the old days 10,000 euros a year. Obviously that's going to be a lot more now, I would imagine, and it depends on what criteria the Brits put on the French living in the UK, because they'll balance that to see, you know, how much are they going to say for them and how much are they going to say for Brits living in France. The language test will only be necessary if you're trying to become a citizen, a French, you know, a French national with a French passport. Then you would need to take a language test. But to live here, as you know, other Americans and any other nationalities do, you'll just need to prove that you're not going to be, you know, claiming off the state and, you know, looking for dole money or something like that, to prove that you have enough money to live in France, and you will have to apply for a visa, to be a long stay visa, to be able to do that.
Brilliant. So I think the final question, I think we've got time for one more, a really fun one. Lucy Lawrence wants to know, we're looking to move to France with our daughter and her family. What is preferable, looking for a large property or buying separate properties? Any quick tips from a kind of a legal versus family?
I would say it really depends on your situation. If you decide to sell, then you're going to have double the amount. One could be, you know, you might have capital gains tax or whatever. Or if one person wants to leave, then that part of that home will become separate for capital gains tax as well. Probably more of a legal question for you there, Barbara, but I would go and do it anyway.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, Barbara?
On that specific point, well, it's a very subjective decision, isn't it? Really, it will depend on you know, how they want to to spend their time. But I would probably say buy a big property, but you know, have the gîte on the side where the daughter can live.
Yeah, I think I'm a big fan of separate but together.
Yes.
Yeah.
So look, we've run out of time, and there's lots more questions. There's a lot of people are going to want to get in contact with either of you, so they can do that through your websites, can't they?
Yeah.
We've also got a lot of wonderful resources on aplaceinthesun.com. We've got a downloadable guide to buying in France. We've got currency advice. We've got professionals, lawyers, all sorts of people that you might need. So we have to close up now, but thanks very much, guys, and good luck with your property search in France. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.